Last month, my entire life was reduced to a single text message. Not a face-to-face conversation. Not even a phone call. Just a line in our family WhatsApp group, sent at 4:17 p.m. On a Friday. We think it's best if Claire steps away from client management for now. That was it. That was how my father, the man who raised me and built the business I had devoted my entire adult life to, cut me out. One group chat message, followed by a chorus of relatives hitting reply with words of agreement or a quick thumbs-up emoji, like I had been voted off an island. After everything I had built for them, after carrying more than my share of the weight, I was discarded like an afterthought. Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just about money. It's about betrayal, it's about family politics, and it's about the moment when the people who thought they held all the power realized that they had underestimated me for far too long. If you love stories about families tearing themselves apart over secrets, money, and control, make sure you like this video, subscribe for more, and share it with someone who might need to hear that sometimes walking away is the most powerful move of all. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been pushed aside by the very people who should have been standing beside you? My name is Claire Whitman. I'm 32 years old, and until that message, I had given every ounce of my energy to our family's legacy. The Whitmans aren't just any family in Connecticut. We are the Whitmans of Greenwich. My grandfather built Whitman and Associates from scratch after World War II. My father, Charles Whitman, expanded it into a respected name across the Northeast. And my mother, Elaine, perfected the image of the glamorous hostess, sealing multi-million-dollar deals over her lemon meringue pie at our dining table. From the outside, we were polished, powerful, untouchable, but on the inside, the cracks had been forming for years. I had always been the odd one out, the little girl who asked too many questions. Even when I graduated top of my class from Wharton with a double major in finance and economics, I was treated like I still needed guidance. When I joined the firm at 24, I was placed under my cousin Ethan, who barely scraped through a state college program. My father's explanation? He's been here longer. He had been there 7 months longer. That was the justification for putting me under him, even as I outperformed every projection I touched. For 8 years, I quietly became the engine of Whitman and Associates. My strategies consistently beat the market by 7 to 9%, while most firms celebrated too. Clients specifically requested me. I was responsible for nearly 2/3 of the firm's profits, 1/4. But inside the boardroom, my father credited the team while clapping Ethan on the back. My Aunt Margaret, who had never worked a day in her life, collected equal profit shares and recycled my ideas as her own, weeks after I presented them. My uncles interrupted me mid-slide with lines like, "That's all very technical, what does your father think?" Still, I kept going. I believed that if I was patient, if I worked hard enough, eventually they would see me for what I was. But then came that group message. My father's text landed like a knife. After a so-called discussion with the senior family members, it had been decided that I would step away. Uncle Stephen agreed within seconds. Aunt Margaret endorsed it. Ethan volunteered to take over my clients, and my mother, always keeping the peace, chimed in with, "We only want what's best." I sat there staring at my phone. I could have cried. I could have begged them to reconsider. I could have defended myself, but I didn't. Instead, I typed the calmest, most devastating sentence of my life. Understood. I'll respect that decision and step away from the family fund as well. Wishing you all continued success. Short. Polite. A farewell wrapped in silk. They didn't yet realize what it meant, but they would soon. Because I wasn't just a passive member of the family fund. My contribution alone was $4.2 million, nearly 35% of the entire pool, and it had grown by another $1.7 million from my investments. And unlike my relatives, I had built safeguards. I had filed patents for my algorithms, documented my contracts, and ensured my personal business was airtight and separate. I had prepared for the day they would push me too far. That night, I logged into the bank portal and initiated the withdrawal. A few clicks, a confirmation window, and suddenly, $5.9 million was on its way out of the Whitman family fund. I notified the attorney, as required, blind copied myself, and closed my laptop. The system's alerts went out immediately. Any administrator on the account would have received a notification about a major withdrawal. But it was Friday night, and I knew most of them were out at dinner or on weekend trips. They wouldn't check until later. At 7:30 p.m., my phone started buzzing. By 10:47 p.m., the calls from my father came one after another. At 2:15 a.m., his voicemail trembled with panic. "The bank has frozen everything. We can't access $1. Claire, call me back right now." By sunrise, I had 89 missed calls, 43 messages, and 17 voicemails. I didn't answer a single one. Instead, I sat in my Brooklyn Heights brownstone, made myself tea, and watched the city lights fade into dawn. For the first time in my life, I felt calm. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to win their approval. I was simply honoring their decision. And that was only the beginning of how the Whitmans, a family so certain of their control, would discover that the person they had dismissed as the weakest link was the one holding the chain together. The real story begins long before that Friday night, with the legacy of the Whitmans and the cracks that had been spreading under the surface for years. When people hear the name Whitman in Greenwich, Connecticut, they think of wealth, legacy, and power. But for me, growing up inside that name felt less like privilege and more like a cage. I was Claire Whitman, the daughter of Charles and Elaine Whitman, and from the outside, our lives were the stuff of glossy magazine spreads. We lived in a sprawling colonial estate with manicured gardens that looked like something out of a history book. The hallways were lined with original oil paintings and expensive sculptures, and our dining room table had seen the likes of senators, governors, CEOs, and even a former president. At every dinner party, my mother floated through the room in elegant dresses, offering her signature lemon meringue pie as though it were part of some unspoken ritual that kept the Whitman empire intact. I learned very early that appearances meant everything. My father, Charles, wore his success like a second skin. He wasn't just the CEO of Whitman and Associates. He was a man whose name could silence a room. His handshake carried weight. His approval was currency. To the financial world, he was brilliant, steady, the man who had expanded my grandfather's modest post-war firm into a respected powerhouse that handled hundreds of millions in assets. To me, he was someone who looked at me and saw potential only in theory, never in practice. From childhood, I was different. While my cousins played outside with toys or video games, I sat cross-legged on the living room floor, flipping through the stock pages my father left scattered around the house. I didn't just skim, I studied. By age 10, I was asking questions about bond yields and market volatility that sometimes left my father without an immediate answer. That moment when I saw hesitation in his eyes stuck with me. I think, in his mind, it wasn't pride he felt. It was discomfort. A daughter who could outpace him intellectually was not a triumph. It was a threat. By the time I was in high school, family dinners had turned into rehearsals for my future role. My uncles would ask Ethan, my cousin, what he thought of the markets. He'd shrug and repeat whatever headline he'd read online that day. When I offered detailed analysis, citing trends and data, the room would go silent. Then someone would clear their throat and shift the attention back to Ethan. The message was clear. His half-baked comment carried more weight than my carefully considered insight because he was a man and I was not. Still, I pushed forward. I worked harder than anyone. I graduated from Wharton at the top of my class, double majoring in finance and economics. I returned home thinking, finally, my family would see me as an equal. Finally, the Whitmans would recognize that I was not just another daughter to be married off into strategic alliances, but someone who could grow the family empire beyond what my grandfather had ever imagined. Instead, When I joined Whitman and Associates at 24, my father placed me under Ethan's supervision. Ethan, who had barely managed to graduate from a state college with a business degree, suddenly had authority over me. "He's been here longer," my father said with that dismissive tone I knew too well. Longer, by exactly 7 months. 7 months of incompetence versus 24 years of preparation, and I was told to follow his lead. It was humiliating, but I kept my head down. I learned every inch of the business. I spent nights running simulations, perfecting strategies, and creating investment models that no one else in the firm could have dreamed of. And when my projections consistently delivered returns above the market average, sometimes 2, sometimes 5, sometimes 7% higher, it was Ethan who basked in the glow. My father would smile at him in board meetings, saying things like, "Our investment team has been doing solid work." Our team. That phrase tasted like ash in my mouth. Meanwhile, I watched my family siphon the rewards of my labor into the Whitman Family Fund. It was a $12 million pool that all of us contributed to, meant for new business ventures, vacation homes, or whatever luxury the elders decided we needed. My contribution alone accounted for $4.2 million, nearly 35% of the entire fund. But no one spoke of that. No one acknowledged that without my steady hand, that pool would have been a fraction of its size. They treated it as though the money simply appeared, as though my calculations and sacrifices were background noise. The Whitman home itself became a constant reminder of how invisible I was. The walls displayed photos of my father shaking hands with politicians, my mother at charity galas, Ethan receiving some second-rate award, smiling like he'd achieved something of merit. Not once did a framed photo commemorate the day I walked across the Wharton stage as valedictorian. Not once did my patents, 7 in total, algorithms I had developed on weekends when everyone else was at the lake house, earn a place on those walls. I had built more for them than they would ever admit. And yet, every time I entered the mahogany-paneled conference room in our downtown office, I was still the little girl with too many questions. My uncles cut me off mid-sentence. Aunt Margaret, who had never worked in finance, had a permanent seat at the board table and the uncanny ability to repeat my ideas weeks later as though they were hers. My father, the man who should have been my greatest advocate, dismissed my strategies with a wave of his hand whenever they threatened to overshadow his traditional instincts. I can still remember the night that crystallized the truth for me. It was Thanksgiving. We were gathered around the table in Greenwich, the crystal glasses catching the chandelier light, the turkey carved with mechanical precision. My Uncle Stephen raised his glass and toasted the Whitman family business, where we all pull our weight and share the rewards equally. The room erupted in applause, laughter, clinking glasses. I smiled. I raised my glass. But inside, my mind was running numbers. That quarter, my division had accounted for 62% of the company's profits. I was the one pulling more weight than all of them combined, and yet I was invisible. That was the moment I made a silent promise to myself. If they could not see me, if they refused to respect what I brought to the table, then I would build a new table. Quietly, carefully, strategically. I would keep showing up, keep driving their profits, but in the shadows, I would also create something they could never touch. I started to funnel my energy into a separate portfolio, meeting with startup founders while the rest of the family drank wine at Lake George. I invested in emerging technologies while they bought luxury cars. I filed my patents under my own name, not the company's. I purchased a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights under an LLC, transforming it into a headquarters for a small, loyal team bound by ironclad NDAs. Every move I made was deliberate, every step one closer to freedom. And still, to them, I was just Claire, the daughter, the cousin, the background player who should wait her turn. They didn't realize that while they dismissed me, I was building leverage they would one day regret underestimating. Because in families like mine, where appearances matter more than truth, you can get away with pretending for years. But the numbers don't lie. And sooner or later, The numbers always come due. What I didn't know then was just how soon that reckoning would arrive, and just how dramatically it would shake the foundation of the Whitman empire. When I officially joined Whitman and Associates at 24, I thought I was stepping into the beginning of a new chapter. I imagined myself at the table, contributing ideas, finally being recognized as more than the girl who once sat cross-legged in the living room flipping through stock pages. I had graduated top of my class at Wharton, with a double major in finance and economics. I had earned this. But the reality of my place in the family business hit me like ice water the moment my father told me I would be reporting to Ethan. Ethan Whitman, my cousin, was the embodiment of entitlement without merit. He had scraped through a business program at a state college, leaving behind a trail of half-finished assignments and professors who passed him out of pity rather than ability. His resume was unimpressive, his insights shallow, and his work ethic questionable at best. But he had one thing I didn't: 7 months of seniority at the firm. That was enough, according to my father, to make him my supervisor. "You need to understand how we do things in the real world," my father had said, his hand heavy on my shoulder, his tone filled with the kind of condescension that stripped me of the degree I had worked years to earn. "Ethan's been here longer. 7 months longer." That was the hill they chose to place me beneath. The humiliation was sharp, but I bit it down and forced myself to move forward. Every day, I came in before Ethan, stayed after him, and carried projects that he never fully understood. When he presented half-baked strategies to clients, I had already done the background work that made them viable. When numbers exceeded expectations, the credit was his. My father would beam in board meetings, proud of his nephew's instincts, while my detailed analyses sat in my drawer, unacknowledged. For years, this became the rhythm of my life. I worked silently, deliberately, without complaint, and yet, the resentment simmered beneath the surface. I couldn't help but notice how quickly everyone deferred to Ethan. My uncles called on him to speak first in meetings, even when it was my division's results on the agenda. My Aunt Margaret would praise his fresh perspective, though his ideas were recycled from articles he'd skimmed the night before. The absurdity of it all should have broken me, but instead, it sharpened me. My performance couldn't be denied, no matter how hard they tried to bury it. Year after year, my strategies beat market averages. When the industry was celebrating 2% returns, my models delivered 7, sometimes 9. Clients began to notice. They requested me directly. They called me after hours to ask for my advice, not Ethan's. 8. And while my father insisted that clients come to us for the Whitman name, I knew the truth. They came for me. But in the boardroom, when results were presented, my father never once said my name. "Our investment team has been working hard," he would announce. Ethan would nod, taking notes as if he had been the one burning the midnight oil. The Whitman Family Fund became another battlefield where my contributions went unrecognized. It was a $12 million pool, supposedly created for family growth and stability, but in reality, it funded beach houses and European vacations for relatives who had never worked a day in finance. My share alone amounted to $4.2 million, nearly 35% of the fund. And yet, I had the same single vote as my Aunt Margaret, who spent her days attending luncheons and gossiping about charity boards. There was no proportional recognition, no acknowledgement that without my investment, the fund would be crippled. My money had become their safety net, and still they treated me as though I were a guest in my own family. But the dismissal wasn't always blatant. Sometimes it was subtle, woven into conversations meant to sound like guidance. After meetings, my mother would pull me aside, her voice gentle, her words cutting. "Honey, men don't like women who sound too smart," she'd whisper. "You need to let your father and uncles feel important." As if intelligence was a liability I had to hide. As if all my late nights and sleepless weekends were a problem, not an asset. Even the victories I did secure were stolen in plain sight. I still remember presenting a detailed report on international markets one quarter. It was thorough, supported by data, outlining a strategy that could expand Whitman and Associates into Europe. The board nodded, skeptical but listening. The idea was tabled for further consideration. 3 weeks later, Margaret raised her hand in another meeting and said, "I've been thinking we should expand into Europe." The room lit up with approval. My father praised her vision. I sat there, silent, my hands folded, watching as my work was paraded under someone else's name. Not everyone was blind. Olivia, my cousin, saw it too. Over lunch one afternoon, she leaned across the table and whispered, "They do the same thing to me. Worse, actually. Because I don't have your skills to make them money. They just want me to marry someone who can help the business." Her words struck me, because I realized it wasn't just about me. The system was built to keep women like us in the background, no matter how much we achieved. I stayed loyal anyway. I told myself that recognition would come eventually, that if I kept my head down and my work impeccable, my family would have no choice but to admit my value. I built my life around that belief, convincing myself that patience was strategy. I poured myself into the family business, giving them everything while quietly constructing a safety net of my own. My personal portfolio grew steadily. By the time I turned 32, I had amassed $17 million in independent investments, though I told no one. I filed patents for my algorithms, building intellectual property under my own name. I bought a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, turning it into a sanctuary where I could work free from interruptions. A loyal team of analysts and engineers worked with me under strict NDAs, helping me develop what I couldn't in the shadow of my father. Some might call it paranoia, others might call it preparation. To me, it was survival. Because even as I convinced myself that my family would one day recognize me, a quiet voice inside whispered the truth I didn't want to hear. They never would. And when that day of reckoning came, I would need more than talent. I would need leverage. I didn't know it then, but that leverage would soon become the only thing standing between me and complete erasure from the empire I had helped build. And the first crack in the surface, the first sign that my patience had been a mistake, was about to arrive sooner than I expected. I used to believe betrayal came in single sharp moments, the kind of cinematic blow you see coming just before it lands. But in my family, betrayal was quieter, subtler, spread out across years like a series of paper cuts. One cut on its own was almost invisible, something you could brush off, convince yourself wasn't worth noticing. But when they came day after day, meeting after meeting, each one slicing just a little deeper, eventually you looked down and realized you were bleeding out. At Whitman and Associates, my days became a routine of invisible victories. I would prepare for meetings with binders full of research, models that took weeks to perfect, strategies tested against multiple risk scenarios. I would walk into the conference room, polished and prepared, and wait for my chance to present. But before I could finish the second slide, my Uncle Stephen would clear his throat loudly, signaling his impatience. "That all seems unnecessarily complicated," he would say, his voice dripping with condescension. "Clients trust the Whitman name because we keep things simple and reliable." And just like that, hours of work would vanish into thin air. My Aunt Margaret, sitting in her chair with manicured hands folded neatly in her lap, would nod vigorously. "Exactly. All these algorithms and technical strategies just confuse people." She had no idea what she was dismissing, but she didn't need to. She had the Whitman last name, and that alone made her opinion weigh more than my expertise. Each time this happened, I could feel heat rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I told myself that I wasn't just speaking to my uncles and aunts, I was speaking to the numbers. And the numbers didn't lie. When the Westfield account saw a 14% return in just one quarter using my strategy, I thought maybe, finally, that proof would be enough. But when I presented it, my father's response was not pride or recognition. It was a scowl. "You implemented this without authorization? That's not how we do things here." I reminded him that he had told me to do whatever I thought best with Westfield since the account was underperforming. He didn't even flinch. I certainly didn't authorize a complete overhaul. We both knew he barely listened when I spoke to him that day. More interested in the golf tournament playing on the office television than in his daughter's plan to salvage a failing portfolio. That was the game. They ignored me when I asked permission, then punished me when I acted decisively. Ethan played his role perfectly. He would walk in late to meetings with nothing but a coffee cup in one hand and his phone in the other, announce that he had just been on a call with one of my clients, and suddenly the room shifted to make space for him. My father would beam at him. "No problem, son. Client relationships always come first. Why don't you tell us how that's going before Claire starts with all her numbers?" And so, the first 20 minutes of every meeting were filled with Ethan parroting half-truths and half-understandings of strategies I had spent months refining. He would stumble through, misrepresenting key components, and my family would nod like he had cracked the code of the financial universe. By the time it was my turn to present, their patience had already thinned. They leaned back in their chairs, eyes glazing over as I spoke, waiting only for a reason to cut me off. It wasn't just meetings. The dismissal followed me everywhere. At client lunches, I would start explaining complex tax strategies, only for my father to interrupt mid-sentence. "What Claire means is," he'd begin, reducing my carefully calculated advice into some oversimplified metaphor about boats or houses, smiling warmly as though he had saved the client from drowning in jargon. I would sit there, smiling politely, seething inside as I watched clients nod along to his mistranslations. Then there were the times I wasn't even in the room. I discovered, more than once, that Ethan had taken one of my models, stripped it down to a vague outline, and presented it as his own. At a staff training session, he stood in front of junior associates, walking them through his risk assessment framework. I recognized every line. I had spent weeks building it, refining it. Not a single word of credit. The associates scribbled notes, looking at him with admiration that should have been directed at me. And sometimes, it was as blatant as exclusion. One Tuesday morning, I arrived early to prepare for a meeting with one of our largest clients, only to find the meeting already in progress. Through the glass conference room walls, I could see my father, my uncle, and Ethan sitting with the clients using the slides I had created. I stood frozen, watching from the hallway as my life's work was passed off as theirs. When the clients nodded approvingly, my father and Ethan exchanged congratulatory glances, like co-conspirators celebrating a perfect heist. It was like being erased in real time. The final straw, however, wasn't even professional, it was personal. That same week, I learned about a family retreat at my uncle's lake house in Lake George. Every senior member of the family was invited, except me. My name had been deliberately left off the chain. I wasn't just being excluded from business strategy, I was being excluded from family itself. I sat in my office that night long after everyone else had gone home, staring at my computer screen without really seeing it. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but no work came. Instead, memories flooded back. Every time I had been silenced. Every time someone else had taken credit. Every time my father had patted me on the shoulder instead of recognizing me as his equal. I thought about my mother's whispered warnings not to intimidate men with intelligence. I thought about Margaret stealing my ideas, about Ethan stealing my clients, about my father stealing my authority. And in that silence, I finally let myself acknowledge what I had been too afraid to admit. No matter how much I gave, no matter how much I proved myself, they would never see me as an equal. I had been bleeding slowly for years, convincing myself that each paper cut wasn't worth fighting over. But now, staring at my own reflection in the darkened office window, I realized I was covered in wounds. That was the night something in me shifted. I stopped waiting for recognition that would never come. I stopped hoping that patience would earn me a seat at the table. If I wanted respect, I would have to take it. I didn't know exactly how or when, but I knew this. The next time they tried to cut me, they would discover I had been sharpening my own knives all along. And it wouldn't be long before they pushed me far enough to see just how deep I could cut back. The quarterly planning meeting was supposed to be my chance to prove, once again, why I mattered. I had spent weeks preparing a presentation, refining every chart, every model, every projection, until it gleamed with precision. My strategy had the potential to increase client returns by 12%, a number that, if it came from anyone else, would have made the room buzz with excitement. That morning, I walked into the mahogany-paneled conference room, carrying neatly stacked reports, my nerves steady but my determination sharp. This was my work, my proof. But when I entered, Ethan was already there, late as usual, a coffee cup in one hand, and his phone in the other. He strolled in 15 minutes past the hour, unbothered, without so much as a notebook. "Sorry I'm late," he announced, not sounding sorry at all. "I was just wrapping up a call with the Donovan account." The Donovan account was mine. I had been cultivating that client for 6 months, building trust, studying their portfolio, aligning my strategy with their needs. I had asked Ethan to sit in on one preliminary call, just one, while I finished final touches on my quarterly projections. And now he stood in front of everyone, using that sliver of involvement to claim the relationship as his. My father's face lit up. "No problem, son. Client relationships always come first. Why don't you tell us how that's going before Claire starts with all her numbers?" "Son. Not nephew. Not employee. Son." For the next 20 minutes, I sat there, my hands folded tightly on the table, listening as Ethan regurgitated pieces of my work, twisting them into a narrative that barely held water. He misrepresented entire sections of the strategy, cutting out the key elements that made it viable, and my family nodded along as though he had just delivered brilliance. Every approving glance burned into me. Finally, when it was my turn, I distributed my reports and began to walk through my slides. I had barely reached the second slide when Uncle Stephen interrupted. "This all seems unnecessarily complicated," he said with a dismissive wave. "Clients trust the Whitman name because we keep things simple." Before I could respond, Aunt Margaret jumped in, her voice syrupy sweet. "Exactly. These algorithms, these strategies, people don't want all that. They just want the comfort of knowing their money is safe." I inhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay composed. "Actually, our client surveys indicate the opposite. They're coming to us because they want more sophisticated approaches. The market is changing. If we don't adapt, we'll lose clients to firms that are willing to." My father tapped his pen against the table. I knew that sound. It meant his patience was wearing thin. "Claire, theory is one thing, but we deal in practical realities here." I steadied my voice. "This isn't theory. I've already implemented this approach with the Westfield portfolio. They've seen a 14% return in just one quarter." For a moment, the room fell silent. Even Ethan looked startled. Then my father leaned forward, his tone sharp. "You implemented this without authorization? That's not how we do things here." Heat flushed my cheeks. "We discussed it last month. You said I could do whatever I thought best since the account was underperforming." "I certainly didn't authorize a complete overhaul," he snapped. The lie sat between us, heavy and undeniable. We both knew he hadn't listened when I explained my plan. He had been more interested in the golf tournament playing on the office television than in his daughter's strategy to rescue a failing account. But now, in front of the others, he painted me as reckless. And then Ethan swooped in. "I have a simpler approach we could consider," he said casually, not even bothering to open a folder or pull out notes. He talked in circles, offering a watered-down version of strategies I had pitched last year, stripped of the details that actually made them effective. Yet the room leaned in, listening attentively, nodding approvingly. When he finished, my father smiled. "Now that's the kind of straightforward thinking our clients expect from the Whitman name. Let's develop Ethan's approach for next quarter." Some no. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up, slam my fists on the table, and demand they acknowledge the truth. But I didn't. I sat there, my nails biting into the palms of my hands, my face calm even as my chest burned. After the meeting, I followed my father into his office. "Dad, I'm concerned about the direction we're taking," I said carefully. "Ethan's strategy has significant gaps. It could expose our clients to unnecessary risk." He didn't even look up from his phone. "Claire, you're too caught up in the details. This business was built on relationships and instinct, not just numbers and charts." "But the numbers and charts are what keep us compliant with regulations," I pushed. "They're what actually grow client wealth." Finally, he looked up, his expression hard. "You know what your problem is? You've never trusted the family way of doing things. You always think your fancy degree makes you smarter than everyone else." The words hit me like a slap. I had managed more than 300 million in client assets. I had strategies that doubled the firm's value in less than a decade. And still, I was just the daughter who thought she was smarter than everyone else. As I left his office, I overheard Aunt Margaret talking to Uncle Stephen in the break room. "Claire's presentations give me a headache," she said. "All those charts and big words, like she's trying to make us feel stupid. Charles needs to rein her in." My uncle agreed. "The girl doesn't understand our culture, never has." I walked past them quietly, their words slicing through me more deeply than I wanted to admit. I closed my office door, sat at my desk, and let the weight of it all sink in. For the first time, I allowed myself to truly acknowledge what had been growing inside me for years. I would never be fully respected in this family business, no matter how much I contributed. The final blow came days later. I arrived early to prepare for a meeting with one of our largest clients, only to discover the meeting had already started without me. Through the glass walls I saw my father, my uncle, and Ethan seated with the clients. My slides were on the screen, my charts and models, the very ones I had labored over. And as the clients nodded approvingly, my father and Ethan exchanged proud, congratulatory glances. Later, I learned about a family retreat at my uncle's lake house in Lake George. Every senior family member was invited, except me. I stood in my office that night, staring at the city skyline beyond the window, and felt a cold certainty settle into my bones. The paper cuts were over. This was a knife to the heart. And it was in that moment I knew something had to change. They would never give me the respect I deserved. If I wanted it, I would have to take it. And very soon, I would. The message arrived on a Friday afternoon, as if they had coordinated the timing to ruin my weekend. My father sent it to our family WhatsApp group, the one meant for business updates but more often filled with golf scores and vacation photos. After considerable discussion among the senior members, it read, "We think it would be best if Claire steps away from client management for now. We appreciate her background work, but recent feedback suggests clients respond better to our traditional approach. This isn't permanent, just a chance to realign with the Whitman way." I stared at the screen. My Uncle Stephen immediately replied, "Completely agree. Smart move." Aunt Margaret added, "Endorsed." Ethan was quick to volunteer, practically giddy. "Happy to transition her accounts," my mother chimed in, predictably, with, "We only want what's best for everyone." Not one question, not one defense, not one acknowledgement of the numbers I had generated, the clients I had saved, the profits I had delivered. It was unanimous. They had decided my fate over a group chat, stripping me of my authority with the casual efficiency of deleting a calendar invite. I didn't respond right away. I sat there, letting the silence stretch, watching as the thread filled with more affirmations from cousins and uncles. People who, just weeks earlier, had whispered their private support in the hallways, now typed public approval like obedient foot soldiers. 17 minutes ticked by. 17 minutes of my life unraveling. 17 minutes of my heart beating louder than the pings of my phone. And then I wrote, "Understood. I'll respect that decision and step away from the family fund as well. Wishing you all continued success." It was short, professional, and it carried the kind of weight they didn't yet understand. Because the family fund wasn't just a side account, It was the backbone of every Whitman deal, a $12 million pool built from our combined contributions. My share alone was $4.2 million, nearly 35% of the total, and it had grown by another $1.7 million through my investments. They had always assumed my contribution was just another stream feeding the river, something they could count on without question. They never considered what would happen if I chose to close the faucet. That night, I opened my laptop and logged into the bank portal. The steps were simple, too simple for something that would shake the foundation of my family's empire. I navigated through the account, my cursor hovering over the option to withdraw. A small box popped up. "Are you sure?" My chest tightened, but my hand didn't shake. I clicked, "Yes." Within seconds, $5.9 million was set in motion, my funds leaving the family pool. I drafted a formal email to our attorney, Jonathan Pierce, citing the section of the family agreement that allowed major contributors to exit with proper notice. I blind copied myself for records, then closed my laptop. For a moment, I just sat there in the stillness of my Brooklyn Heights brownstone, the glow of the city skyline seeping in through the windows. A strange calm washed over me. The bridge I had just burned was massive, but the liberation was intoxicating. Of course, it didn't stay calm for long. By 7:30 p.m., my phone began to buzz. At first, it was just a few notifications, missed calls, WhatsApp messages. By 10:47 p.m., the screen lit up non-stop with my father's name, call after call, relentless. By midnight, my cousins were chiming in, some angry, some confused. By 2:15 a.m., my father's voice was cracking in the voicemails. The earlier messages had been sharp with anger. "Claire, this is unacceptable. Call me back immediately." But by the middle of the night, the tone shifted. "What happened? The bank has frozen everything. We can't access a single dollar. Claire, please, call me back right now." The panic in his voice was unlike anything I had ever heard. My father, the unshakable Charles Whitman, the man who carried himself with unflinching confidence, was unraveling. The fund was locked down. The bank had flagged the sudden withdrawal as suspicious activity. What none of them realized was that this was standard protocol. I had anticipated it. I had planned for it. By sunrise, I had 89 missed calls, 127 text messages, 43 WhatsApp notifications, and 17 voicemails. My phone was a graveyard of desperation. I let it buzz. I made myself tea. I watched the light spread across the Manhattan skyline, steady and unbothered. On Saturday, my phone rang again, this time with a name that made me answer, Sophie. She and I had been friends since college, and she now worked as a senior manager at the bank handling our family fund. She couldn't give me details, she was bound by regulations, but she didn't need to. Her voice carried a hint of amusement. "Your family is creating quite a scene," she said. "Your father has been on the phone with 3 different departments. Your uncle even showed up in person demanding to see the president of the bank." I exhaled slowly. "I'm sorry for the trouble." "Don't be," Sophie said. "From what I can tell, everything you did was completely by the book. The freeze is just protocol. It'll lift as soon as verification is complete." I thanked her. When I hung up, I smiled faintly. Everything was unfolding exactly as I had anticipated. But the messages kept pouring in. My Uncle Stephen accused me of sabotage. Aunt Margaret claimed I was being emotional. Ethan whined about the Henderson deal, a $20 million real estate project that now hung by a thread because they couldn't access the funds for the down payment. My mother's messages were tearful pleas for family loyalty, invoking my grandfather's name as if his ghost could guilt me into compliance. Each new message revealed the depth of their panic, and the more desperate they became, the calmer I felt. Still, not all the messages were the same. One stood out. It was from Olivia, my cousin, the one person who had ever truly understood my position. Her message was simple. "Good for you. They never appreciated what you brought to the table. Coffee next week?" I actually laughed when I read it. In the sea of outrage and manipulation, hers was a lifeline. By Saturday night, my father had taken things further. He gave out my personal number to clients, telling them to call me directly about technical issues with their accounts. That was the line he should never have crossed. Clients were separate. I spent 2 hours carefully drafting reassurances, clarifying that their portfolios were unaffected and completely independent from the family fund. I promised we would review everything on Monday if they wished. Not once did I disparage the firm. I didn't need to. My professionalism spoke louder than his desperation. But the storm was far from over. Late that night, Jonathan Pierce, the family's attorney, called. His tone was calm, measured, but I could hear the strain behind it. He confirmed my withdrawal was legally airtight. Still, he said, your father is pushing for an immediate restoration of the funds. He's willing to renegotiate your role at the company. I listened silently, then replied, I'm not making decisions tonight. I'll be available Monday at 9 a.m. in my office. They can come then. And with that, I hung up, knowing the battlefield had already shifted. Because by the time they walked into my brownstone on Monday morning, it wouldn't be as a daughter begging for approval. It would be as the one person holding the cards they never thought I had. And I was ready to play them all. By Monday morning, I was no longer the daughter who begged for approval or the employee who waited for recognition. I was the woman who had stripped 35% of the Whitman family fund out from under them, and I knew they would have no choice but to come to me. I woke up before dawn, my body alive with a nervous energy that felt almost electric. For years, I had walked into their conference rooms, sat at their tables, spoken under their gaze, and felt myself shrink beneath their dismissals. But this meeting would be different. It would be on my terms, in my space, with my rules. I brewed a pot of coffee, arranged pastries on a tray, and set my dining table like a boardroom. Each place had neatly stacked copies of documentation, my withdrawal notice, the bank's verification requirements, and a summary of my conditions. At the head of the table, I left a single folder with my notes. That seat would be mine. At 8:30, my security system pinged. They were early. I looked through the camera feed and saw them standing there. My father, his face drawn but stern. Uncle Stephen, red-faced and already tense. Aunt Margaret, her lips stretched into a strained smile. Ethan, smirking, as if he thought this was a game, and Jonathan Pierce, the attorney, calm as ever with his briefcase in hand. My stomach tightened, but I didn't hesitate. At exactly 8:59, I opened the door. Come in, I said simply, stepping aside. They filed in, their eyes flicking over the brownstone they had never been invited into before. I saw the surprise register on their faces as they noticed the original artwork, the modern furnishings, the quiet elegance of a space that was entirely mine. For years, I had let them believe I lived modestly, that I was still tethered to the family's orbit. Now, every detail of my home told a different story. I was independent, successful, and in control. The dining room is set up for our meeting, I said, leading them down the hall. When they entered, I remained standing at the head of the table. My father hesitated, clearly noting that the position he always occupied was no longer his. Without a word, he sat to my right. The others took their places. I poured coffee with a steady hand, passed around the tray of pastries, and finally took my seat at the head. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken tension, until my father cleared his throat. Claire, we're here to resolve this situation quickly. The Henderson deal. I raised my hand, cutting him off. The gesture was deliberate, the same one he had used countless times to silence me in meetings. His eyes narrowed, but I didn't lower my hand until I had the room's attention. Before we discuss specific deals, we need to address the larger issue, I said evenly. I've withdrawn my contribution from the family fund, as is my right under Section 7.3 of our agreement. The bank has confirmed the transaction is proper, the freeze is temporary, and will lift once verification is complete. Uncle Stephen slammed his hand on the table. This is ridiculous. You're holding the family hostage over hurt feelings, a bruised ego. I turned to him calmly, my voice steady. This isn't about ego, it's about value and respect. For 8 years, my strategies have driven results far above market average. My division generated 62% of the company's profits last quarter. My client satisfaction ratings are the highest in the firm. And yet, I was removed from client management via group text without a single private conversation. That decision made it clear how much my contributions are valued. Aunt Margaret leaned forward, her tone falsely sweet. Honey, we were going to discuss it in detail at the retreat. The group message was just to get the basic decision out first. The retreat I wasn't invited to, I reminded her. That was an oversight, my father interjected quickly. Ethan chuckled under his breath. Come on, Claire. You're blowing this out of proportion. So you got your feelings hurt. Did you really have to blow up a major deal over it? I turned my gaze on him, letting my silence stretch, until his smirk faltered. I didn't blow up anything. I withdrew my personal contribution, which happened to be a larger percentage than anyone anticipated. That reveals the real problem. You've been taking my money and my work for granted. My father leaned forward, his voice firm, but not yet desperate. Whatever mistakes have been made, this response is disproportionate. You've put a $3 million deal in jeopardy. I nodded. A deal that couldn't proceed without my money, and yet I wasn't even consulted. That isn't just disrespectful, it's bad business. Jonathan, the attorney, finally spoke. Perhaps we could focus on immediate solutions first, then address longer-term concerns afterward. The Henderson deadline is the most urgent matter. I inclined my head. That's reasonable. I'm prepared to wire $5 million to the family fund this morning, enough to cover the Henderson down payment with a buffer. But this will not be a contribution. It will be structured as a loan from my personal holdings to the family fund at standard market interest rates, with specific repayment terms. Jonathan can draft the paperwork immediately. For a moment, relief flickered across their faces until my father realized what I had said. A loan? You would charge your own family interest? This is a business transaction, I said evenly. Which is how you've always insisted Whitman and Associates operates. Any other lender would charge significantly more under these circumstances. I'm offering fair terms on short notice. If that's unacceptable, you're free to find another source of financing. Uncle Stephen's face turned crimson. This is extortion! I met his glare without flinching. This is negotiation. The alternative is letting the Henderson deal collapse, which helps no one. The room went quiet. I watched my father's face, saw the calculation in his eyes as he weighed pride against practicality. For years, he had dismissed me, silenced me, minimized me. But now, he was the one cornered. Finally, he exhaled, his voice low. Fine, Jonathan, draw up the loan agreement. In that moment, something shifted. For the first time, they weren't dictating terms to me. I was dictating terms to them. And though they didn't know it yet, the Henderson loan was only the beginning. Because what I had prepared to reveal next would make the $5 million loan look like pocket change compared to the leverage I truly held. Ethan couldn't keep his mouth shut. He leaned back in his chair, smirking as if the Henderson loan was some minor victory he had allowed me. You still need the Whitman name, he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. As much as we need your number crunching, you wouldn't have half of what you do without the family reputation. Let's be realistic, where else would you even go? For years, those words had kept me silent. For years, I had believed that without the Whitman name, I was nothing more than a clever girl with a knack for numbers. But now, sitting at the head of my own table, watching their faces lined with panic, I realized Ethan had handed me the perfect opening. I smiled, a calm, deliberate smile that made him shift in his chair. Actually, I said, my voice even, that brings us to the next item on our agenda. I reached for the small remote I had set beside my folder and pressed a button. The large television on my dining room wall lit up with a logo I had designed months earlier. Bold, clean, undeniable, Whitman Capital Management. The room fell silent. My father's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. Aunt Margaret's forced warmth froze into shock. Uncle Stephen's face darkened, the vein in his temple pulsing. And Ethan, his smirk faltered, replaced by something I had never seen from him before: fear. For the past 4 years, I began, advancing to the next slide, I've been operating my own firm as a separate entity. It started small, evenings and weekends, while the rest of you were at Lake George, or vacationing in Europe. While you were buying luxury cars and celebrating second-rate profits, I was meeting with startup founders, angel investors, and high-net-worth individuals who wanted something different from the stale, traditional Whitman approach. The slide showed growth charts, my growth charts, sharp upward curves that left no room for denial. Our clients have enjoyed an average annual return of 17%. That's nearly double the 9% benchmark at Whitman and Associates. My father leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. That's not possible. You've been working full-time at our firm. When would you have had time to run another business? I met his gaze steadily. Evenings, weekends, the vacation days I never took. Every hour you thought I was wasting with hobbies, I was building something real. I advanced to the next slide, a list of patents, each one bearing my name. I currently hold 7 patents for financial algorithms and trading systems, all registered to me personally, all developed on my own time, using my own resources. That's a violation of your employment contract, Uncle Stephen snapped. His voice cracked like a whip, but I didn't flinch. No, it isn't. I slid a document across the table toward Jonathan, the attorney. My contract specifically allows for personal investment activities, provided they don't directly solicit Whitman clients. I've adhered to that completely. Jonathan adjusted his glasses, scanned the clause, and nodded reluctantly. She's correct. The clause was meant to cover personal stock trading, but it's broad enough that what she's built qualifies. Uncle Stephen's face turned red, nearly purple. This is treachery. This is foresight, I corrected calmly. I knew I would never be respected within Whitman and Associates, so I built something of my own. I clicked to the next slide. A client list. Not enormous, but impressive. 27 high-net-worth clients. None of them Whitmans. These are my independent clients, with a combined $400 million in assets under management. The silence in the room grew heavier. My father's expression shifted, not just shock, but calculation, his mind already racing through implications. Ethan leaned forward, eyes darting across the names on the screen, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to speak but couldn't find words. And that's not all, I said, sliding another set of documents toward Jonathan. 17 of Whitman and Associates' current clients have signed personal service agreements with me. Those contracts include a clause stating that, if I leave the firm, they have the option to transfer their accounts with me. Together, they represent $230 million in assets. Jonathan's brow furrowed as he read. His face grew pale. Finally he looked up. These are valid. Many high-end clients insist on continuity clauses like these. If Claire were to depart, those clients would be entitled to follow her. The weight of the words settled over the room. For years, they had dismissed me as replaceable. Now, they were forced to see that I held in my hands not just my own future, but nearly a third of theirs. My father's voice was quieter when he finally spoke. When did you plan all this? I didn't plan it as revenge, I said, my voice steady but not cold. I planned it because I knew, deep down, that no matter how much I contributed, I would never be fully respected here. This wasn't sabotage, it was self-preservation. I clicked to the final slide. A side-by-side comparison of Whitman and Associates' performance and Whitman Capital's results over the past 4 years. The contrast was undeniable. My firm's line soared while theirs plodded along, respectable but uninspired. I'm not showing you this to gloat, I said softly, though every part of me wanted to savor their expressions. I'm showing you because it proves I've earned the right to be taken seriously. I'm not asking for favors. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for recognition of what I've built and respect for the value I bring. For the first time in my professional life, my father didn't look at me with dismissal. His eyes held something different: respect, yes, but threaded with regret. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of realization pressing down on him. "What do you want, Claire?" he asked quietly. The question hung in the air, heavy with the knowledge that whatever answer I gave would reshape the future of both Whitman and Associates and the family itself. And I already knew exactly what I was going to say. When my father finally asked me, "What do you want, Claire?" The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced in that house before. For years, they had dictated the terms. For years, I had bent, adjusted, swallowed my pride, and hoped that my numbers alone would one day be enough. But that day had come and gone, and the reality staring them in the face was one they could no longer deny. I was no longer asking for recognition. I was defining the rules. I laid it out as calmly as I could, my voice steady though my pulse raced. First, the Henderson loan would proceed immediately under the terms I had outlined. Second, I would take a 30-day leave of absence from Whitman and Associates to allow space for decisions to be made without the constant undertow of family politics. Third, when that period ended, we would reconvene to discuss either my return under new terms or my formal departure with client transitions handled accordingly. These were not suggestions, they were conditions. The reactions were predictable. Uncle Stephen grumbled that I was holding the family hostage. Aunt Margaret tilted her head, trying to soften the room with her syrupy tone. Ethan scoffed, muttering something about how dramatic I was being, but the difference this time was that their noise didn't matter. I watched Jonathan, the attorney, as he read over my proposal. His silence, his careful nods, told me everything I needed to know. It was solid. It was enforceable. It was, in fact, the only path forward. My father finally broke the stalemate. "We accept your terms," he said, his jaw clenched. He looked at Jonathan. "Draw up the loan agreement. Formalize the leave." It was the first time I had ever seen my father use his authority not to crush me, but to yield to me. And in that moment, I understood that something fundamental had shifted. The balance of power was no longer where it used to be. The 30 days that followed were unlike any period of my life. For the first time, I wasn't showing up at dawn to sit in meetings where my words were dismissed. I wasn't chasing approval in boardrooms that were designed to keep me silent. I was free. Free to focus entirely on Whitman Capital. Free to live without the constant weight of being undervalued. My team, the small group I had built under strict NDAs, became my daily circle. Together, we refined strategies, prepared systems, and built contingency plans for every possible outcome. If I had to absorb transferred clients, we were ready. If negotiations collapsed, we were ready. If I decided never to return, we were more than ready. But it wasn't just business. I finally gave myself permission to have a life outside of spreadsheets and boardrooms. I hiked in the White Mountains on weekends, breathing air that didn't smell like office carpets or stale coffee. I reconnected with friends who had long since stopped inviting me to dinners because I always said no. I even started dating again, something I had neglected for years because my family business consumed me like a jealous lover. And then there was Olivia, my cousin. We met for coffee more than once, and in those conversations I saw something shift in her too. She admitted she had always wanted to work in architecture but had been pushed into marketing for the firm because it was safe and useful. Watching me stand up to the family had given her courage. "I've started interviewing," she confessed, her eyes brighter than I had ever seen them. "I want to design buildings, not PowerPoint decks." I smiled, proud of her. For the first time, it felt like maybe I wasn't just reclaiming my own value. I was giving permission to others to do the same. Meanwhile, Jonathan kept me updated. The Henderson deal had gone through smoothly thanks to the loan. My father had even begun implementing some of the strategies I had proposed, the very ones that had once been dismissed as too complicated. And though I knew old habits don't change overnight, there was no denying the tremor in the ground beneath them. My absence had left a hole they couldn't fill with Ethan's charm or Margaret's politicking. For the first time, the family seemed to recognize that my presence wasn't optional. Still, I knew better than to believe one confrontation could undo decades of dismissal. The real test would come when the 30 days ended. That was when I would see whether they truly intended to evolve, or whether they expected me to return quietly to the role of the obedient daughter. The night before the meeting, I sat in my brownstone, my notes organized, my strategies rehearsed, but my mind restless. I walked through the rooms, looking at the artwork I had chosen, the furniture I had bought, the office I had built with my own money. This was mine, not the family's bring, not my father's bring, mine. For the first time in years, I felt no fear about what tomorrow would bring. Whether they accepted my terms or not, I knew I could stand on my own. When the day arrived, I chose the venue carefully. Not the brownstone again that was my sanctuary, and I wasn't going to let them mistake it for a permanent battlefield. I reserved a private dining room at an upscale restaurant in Boston, and instead of the long rectangular table my father always preferred, I arranged for a round one. No head, no hierarchy, no false thrones. If they wanted me back, it would be as an equal. They arrived as a group, just as they had before, but the energy was different this time. The anger had dulled into something quieter, almost cautious. My father's expression carried a restrained seriousness. Stephen looked weary, less confrontational. Margaret had abandoned her false warmth, though she sat stiffly, ready to adjust whichever way the wind blew. Ethan was subdued, his arrogance thinner than before. And then there were the two surprises. My mother, Elaine, who rarely attended business discussions, and Olivia, who had asked to be present. As we took our seats, I felt the weight of every decision I had made pressing down on this moment. The documents, the withdrawal, the late-night strategies, the refusal to answer their calls. It had all led to this. And when my father finally opened the folder in front of him and said, "We've had time to consider, and we'd like to propose a restructuring," I knew that the real evolution of the Whitmans was about to begin. The folder Jonathan handed me was heavier than it looked, not in weight but in meaning. I opened it slowly, scanning the first few pages, and realized the Whitmans had done something I never thought possible. They had drafted a proposal that acknowledged my worth. My father's voice was steady as he explained, "We're proposing the creation of a new division, Whitman Capital Management, with you as president and CEO. This division would operate with autonomy, its own profit-sharing structure, and your authority would be separate from the traditional family pool." The words hung in the air, fragile but monumental. For the first time, I wasn't being offered a seat at their table. They were offering me my own. I flipped through the documents, noting the ownership stake outlined in black and white, the performance-based compensation, and the clauses that guaranteed decision-making power. This wasn't a token gesture. It was real. I glanced up, meeting my father's eyes, and for once, there wasn't condescension there. There was something closer to respect, maybe even regret. But I had learned too much to accept anything at face value. "What about the family fund?" I asked. Jonathan answered carefully. "The fund will be restructured. From now on, voting rights will be proportional to each member's financial contribution, not equal across the board." It was a seismic shift. For decades, people like Aunt Margaret had wielded as much influence as those of us who carried the weight of the business on our shoulders. With this change, my voice would finally carry the weight it deserved. I studied Margaret's face as Jonathan spoke. Her tight smile betrayed the fury simmering underneath. For someone who had lived comfortably off the labor of others, this was nothing short of a dethroning. "And my independent business?" I pressed. "We propose a merger," Jonathan replied. "Your clients, your patents, your intellectual property would be folded into the new division, with explicit protections for your rights." The personal service agreements will remain intact. You'll retain your clients as their primary advisor. I leaned back, letting it all settle in. They had clearly spent weeks working through every angle, anticipating my objections, crafting something they thought I couldn't refuse. And maybe they were right. It was, objectively, a strong proposal. But I wasn't about to rush into agreement. I'll need time, I said. I want independent legal counsel to review every clause. My father nodded, a flicker of relief passing over his face. Of course, we don't expect an immediate decision. The surprising part wasn't the terms, it was the voices that followed. Uncle Stephen, who had been my harshest critic, cleared his throat. I want to acknowledge something, Claire. I've been resistant to your methods because they weren't how we've always done things, but the results speak for themselves. I was wrong to dismiss them. His words were stiff, awkward, but real. Margaret, ever the opportunist, quickly added, "The business needs to evolve. Your generation brings new perspectives. We should be embracing them." Even Ethan, though visibly uncomfortable, muttered, "I've been reviewing some of your models. There's a depth there I didn't appreciate before." It wasn't much, but from him, it was practically a confession. My mother reached across the round table, her hand brushing mine gently. She hadn't said a word until now, but her eyes were soft, full of something I hadn't seen from her in years' pride. "We should have done this long ago," she whispered. I swallowed hard, emotions rising despite myself. For years, I had dreamed of this moment, not just the recognition, but the validation. And here it was, laid out in legal documents and awkward admissions. But I also knew better than to believe the battle was over. Paper could be signed, words could be spoken, but habits took time to break. The same people who had spent years dismissing me weren't going to transform overnight. The real power wasn't in their proposal. It was in the fact that I had proven I was willing to walk away, and they now knew it. The days that followed were a blur of negotiations. My lawyers combed through every detail, tightening protections, clarifying boundaries. We hammered out lines of authority, succession plans, profit allocations. The more we refined the deal, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about me. It was about reshaping the legacy of the Whitmans. No longer would leadership pass blindly to whoever bore the right last name. From now on, it would be performance, results, and merit. When the agreements were finally signed, Whitman Capital Management was born. My team moved seamlessly under the new banner, and my independent clients were reassured by the continuity clauses. Within months, our division was outperforming every other branch of the company, attracting new clients who were drawn to innovation rather than tradition. Olivia, true to her word, left the firm entirely. She accepted a position at an architectural firm in New York, finally stepping into the career she had once believed out of reach. I invested in her startup design business, not just as family, but as someone who believed in her. Watching her flourish was a reminder that breaking free wasn't just possible, it was necessary. And slowly, my relationship with my father began to shift. We no longer spoke as CEO and subordinate but as two leaders, side by side. There were moments when his old habits slipped through an instinct to override, a reflexive dismissal, but each time, he caught himself. Each time, he adjusted. And each time, I realized, he was learning. One night, nearly a year after the group message that had triggered everything, we sat in his office reviewing quarterly results. He looked at me, his expression uncharacteristically thoughtful. "I've been thinking about your grandfather," he said. When he handed the business to me, he told me something I never understood until now. He said, "The best legacy isn't preservation, it's evolution." I studied him, the man who had fought me at every turn. "Evolution is harder than preservation," I said. "It means admitting the old way wasn't perfect." He nodded slowly. "And pride makes that difficult. I resisted your changes because I thought I was protecting what he built. But maybe what I was really doing was holding it back." For the first time, I saw him not as the towering figure I had spent my life trying to impress, but as a man flawed, aging, and finally willing to evolve. But even as the Whitmans began to change, I knew one truth. Legacies are fragile. They can be rebuilt, reshaped, even redeemed, but they can just as easily crumble if the lessons are forgotten. And as much as I wanted to believe my family had learned, a part of me wondered how long it would last, and whether the respect I had finally claimed could survive the next storm that was sure to come. Looking back now, I realize the most painful part of my story wasn't the rejection itself, it was the years I spent believing that if I just worked harder, if I just stayed patient, eventually my family would see me. I kept giving them everything while asking for nothing in return, hoping that loyalty would be enough to earn respect. It never was. Respect, I learned, isn't something you wait to receive. It's something you decide to claim. When I finally pulled my money from the family fund, when I stood my ground in my own home, when I revealed the empire I had quietly built in the shadows, it wasn't just about leverage. It was about choosing myself. For the first time in my life, I stopped begging for a seat at their table and built my own. And in doing so, I discovered something liberating. I had been enough all along. I didn't need their approval to validate my worth. What came after the restructuring, the acknowledgements, the new division with my name on it, those were victories, yes. But the real triumph was internal. I no longer defined myself by their acceptance. I no longer measured my value by their recognition. I had already proven, to myself most of all, that I could stand on my own. If there's one lesson I want you to take from my story, it's this. Don't wait for others to validate your worth. If you keep handing them the power to define you, they will use it to keep you small. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step away, even if it means burning bridges you once thought were unbreakable. Because on the other side of that fire is freedom, the kind of freedom that allows you to build, to grow, to thrive on your own terms. So if you've ever felt dismissed, undervalued, or overlooked, I want you to hear me clearly. Your worth is not negotiable. It's not a debate. It doesn't shrink just because others refuse to see it. It's yours to claim, and the moment you do, everything changes. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If my story resonated with you, please like this video, share it with someone who might need the reminder, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your voice and standing your ground. And I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to take a stand to prove your worth? What happened when you finally did?